I want to talk to you today about planets in the 12th house and a little bit about the 12th house in general. The reason that I want to talk about these planets are that in the 12th house, it seems to be an area that students struggle to really understand when they're learning astrology. And when students have studied a little bit of astrology, I notice there is a real sense of concern or worry about planets in the 12th house and this being bad or really negative or going to cause huge problems in their life. So in 2020, I've given 2 webinars exploring the 12th house from different angles, and those webinars are available. I'm going to link them in the show notes below. What I wanted to do today is share a little bit about my own experience to do with a planet that I have in the 12th house and just weave into that conversation a little bit about the 12th house in general. Even though the 12th house is this kind of mysterious, murky place that's often described as being bad or even terrible, what I'd like to do, or what I think it's important to understand is where that comes from. Why is the 12th house described the way it is? And what does it really mean to have a planet in the 12th house? So these are really big topics, and to give them their full due, you'll want each of the webinars. There's one webinar called Diving into the Darkness, which is about both the 8th and the 12th houses. And what I do in that webinar is I explore the origins of the topics of the 8th and 12th houses so that you can understand why these houses are associated with the topics and concepts that they are. When you learn the true meaning or essence of the 8th and 12th house, you probably won't be quite as worried about planets in the 8th house or the 8th or 12th house in general as you are now. The second webinar, which is designed to follow on from that first webinar, the first webinar is called Diving into the Darkness, exploring the 8th and 12th houses. The second webinar is called 12th House Planets. And in this webinar, I focus on planets that are in the 12th house. And I go through each of the 10 planets commonly used in modern astrology. And we look at chart examples of people who have the Sun in the 12th house, Venus in the 12th house, Mercury in the 12th house, Mars in the 12th house, Pluto in the 12th house, and so on. So you'll get a real sense of how these planets really operate and what they can bring to your life that might be good and not just troubling. So the 12th house is described as the house of self-undoing. And it has a lot to do with the fact that the planet Saturn has its joy in the 12th house. There are other factors that go into why the 12th house can be a little bit tricky, but I won't repeat myself here. Check out that Diving into the Darkness webinar for more. But I will mention about Saturn having its joy in the 12th house and the idea that the 12th house is a place where we need to take some responsibility for what's going on in that part of our chart. We need to take responsibility for managing planets that might be in the 12th house in our chart. The 12th house is also a house that describes a need for retreat, time alone, or even time away from our regular places, but also away from our regular duties. And one common theme, if you have a lot of planets in the 12th house, is that you do need a fair amount of time alone to recharge or even to check in with yourself, maybe process things, or even to get remotivated and discover enthusiasm. So don't be afraid of being alone if you have planets in the 12th house. That's a really great starting point. For me personally, I have the planet Mars in the 12th house. And I've talked a little bit about how I sometimes feel like I create problems for myself in a blog post on my website called I Do It to Myself, Mars in the 12th house. And I often think about this planet as a planet that I often draw on when I'm writing, in the sense that the 12th house to me seems like a quiet, secluded cave, and writing is done really well in a quiet, secluded environment. So I often think about the 12th house as my writing cave, if you like, but having Mars there, provides a few little challenges for me along the way. Now, there are a number of ways that you can interpret a planet in the 12th house, and one angle that I want to take in the story that I want to share today has to do with that for me personally, Mars is the ruling planet of my second house. So in my chart, Mars is a planet that is responsible for the topic of money, cash flow, and finances. So when you're looking to understand your finances, you want to look at the sign on your second house cusp. I use the whole sign house system, and I've got another video on that. But you might use a different house system. For this kind of house rulership approach, I do recommend either the equal house or whole sign house approach. But yeah, so with the Mars ruled second house, I want to find Mars in my chart to understand my tendencies and patterns with money. So when I first learned about astrology and saw that the ruler of my second house, my money planet, was in the 12th house, I was like, oh God, am I ever going to get my act together with money and finances? And one of the theories that I've come to appreciate now that I'm a little older, on the other side of 40, is that planets in the 12th house may describe things that are difficult for you when you're younger. But with a bit of effort and a bit of attention, you may be able to harness them and focus them, particularly as you age. And to illustrate that point, I want to share about my own experiences with money. So I grew up in a pretty average middle-class style family. We never had a lot of extra money. You know, we certainly weren't the kind of family where we were all wearing the latest clothes or had the coolest toys. I remember when the Cabbage Patch Kids were like all the rage and we got whatever kind of budget line version of that. So we obviously had enough money to get gifts, but we certainly weren't buying top of the range of anything. So I guess just to give you a sense of where I started financially, I'm one of 6 children, so I'm from a large family. So there's certainly, it was enough to, pay the bills. We lived in a house that we owned. I never remember, being hungry or worrying about shelter. So we certainly had financial stability. We just didn't have a lot, but we had enough. And that's really all you need as a child. In my teens, I started working. I got my own, debit card, and I was able to access a bank account that had all of my birthday money that had been given to me through my childhood years, and I was able to have access to that. And I went wild. I would take the money out. I would spend it. I just didn't know what to do with it. I felt like I'd been given this pot of gold, but I really didn't have a sense of what to do with it. And that's those early, late teen years and early 20 years, that continued to be my pattern with money. I was very hardworking. I started working at McDonald's in Sydney when I was 15, when I was old enough to get a job. And I really enjoyed working. So I didn't have a problem earning the money, but I had a lot of problems holding on to money that I did earn. And so I was very good at spending money, basically. And so my teens and my early 20s just kept repeating this pattern. And in my early 20s, I got my first credit card. And that was just, not a good fit for me in the sense that I still hadn't learned how to respect or manage money. And so I went a bit crazy. I ran up the credit card bill. I didn't pay it on time. And I ended up getting a really bad black mark against my name where I couldn't get any credit for the 5 or 7 year timeline. And that was most of my 20s because of the sort of bad or immature choices, irresponsible choices that I'd made about money in my early 20s. I spent the rest of my 20s living on cash because I wasn't able to get credit and paying off the debts that I had accrued. So this was a really classic example of the ruler of the second in the 12th house, where money to me felt like it just vanished. It felt like I didn't have any control over it. It felt like it was a mystery to me. I didn't understand how it worked. And even though I could earn it, I didn't have any skills to help me hold on to it or manage it. So that's where I could certainly see some of the problematic expressions of the ruler of the second in the 12th house. And when I think about, the idea of money being a mystery or it felt like it vanished, it certainly sounds like 12th housey type material. As I crossed into my early 30s, I was starting to get more serious in my business. And of course, I was, an adult now. I'd moved countries. I was starting to figure out how to manage my money better. But it really took me most of my 30s to put those kind of good practices in place to save a little bit of money, to, by that point I was able and allowed to borrow money again. So I had a credit card and I was just getting into better habits with paying that off each month, starting to save a little bit of money for retirement, which, I'd heard about as a concept and my partner had talked to me, but I was just like, I'm too young for this. But then I kind of realized that I wasn't. And by the time I got to my late 30s, I felt that I had really understood how to manage money in the context of the ruling planet of my second house being in the 12th. And for me, this is about being diligent. It's about knowing that if I ignore it, a problem is going to come out of the woodwork, if you like. And so for me, managing the rule of the second in the 12th house has had a lot to do with staying on top of things, of creating systems and checklists, and literally looking at my bank accounts every few days. Right, this needs to go here, or that needs to go here, or this has gone through. It's a little bit more hands-on than I understand other people are with their money, but it helps me stay on track. If I see it, if I know what needs to be done, if I have a little plan, I've written down what my schedule needs to be, that's been really helpful for me. Part of it for me personally as a self-employed individual was that a lot of the early personal finance material that I was reading in my late 20s and early 30s when I started to try and want to figure this out, of course, as I was having my Saturn return and wanting to grow up about a number of things in my life, a lot of that early personal finance material that I was reading was geared to people that were on steady salaries and that were earning the same amount of money week in and week out. And there were suggestions about, X amount of dollars being saved for this or for that. And that confused me because I was self-employed and my income would vary from week to week and month to month. And those systems never quite worked for me. But finally, in my mid-30s, I must have read a book or read enough books or just done enough thinking about it that I realized a percentage-based model was going to work better for me. So instead of saying I have to save $200 a week for retirement, for instance, or to pay off something if I had something I needed to pay off or to save for, I would say I'm going to save 10% of my income. And whatever amount of money I earned that week, I'll just put 10% of it away. And that's been a strategy that has really worked for me. It's like I finally figured out how to make sense of the unique things in my situation and to learned enough maturity or responsibility to figure it out. Now, you might be listening to this thinking, I had the money set down when I was 19 or 21. Obviously, the ruler of your second house is not in the 12th house or in a difficult aspect, because I know I have friends, I even have family members. One of my siblings kind of figured this out very, very early on. Everybody's journey with money or any other topic is totally unique. And one of the ways we describe that individual approach to our experiences is through our birth chart. So all I'm saying is how that's worked for me and how I've understood that journey based on the ruler of the second being in the 12th house for me. And it certainly was really rough in my late teens and early 20s. I wouldn't say it got good in my late 20s, but it stopped getting bad. And it was in my 30s that I really started to figure out how to make it good. And now I've got a great system where I do all of my banking and I pay myself. I do it all on a Thursday, which is Jupiter's day of the week. And I send money off to, the tax account and the retirement account and the savings account or what have you. And it took me a long time to adjust to not spending all the money that came in each week. But I started with a really tiny percentage of like 5%, just so I could get used to not spending everything that I earned. And I could get used to putting a little bit away. And over time, I was able to increase from 5% or up to 10%. And so on. And so it's been a slow journey. And now that I'm technically approaching midlife, I guess, in my early 40s, it's not perfect. I feel like I do have a bit of catch up to, make a bit of things to make up for, not saving for retirement in my 20s and early 30s means I've got to do a little bit more, be a little bit more aggressive on that front now. But I'm happy with what I'm doing because I feel like I've got a handle on it. It no longer feels like a massive mystery to me. I still feel there's quite a magical quality about where money comes from and how I earn money. And sometimes I have to pinch myself and think, I'm an astrologer and I make money doing something totally unusual that I really love. But I know that when money comes into my bank account, I know what I need to do with it to take care of it. So that's a little bit about my journey with the 12th house to do with having the ruler of my second house there in the 12th. There's a lot more I could say about having Mars in the 12th house, but without going into lots of my own personal psychological exploration, I wanted to focus on a really practical topic that I can track the progress with and the improvements with throughout my life, going from somebody who couldn't pay off their credit card bill, in their early 20s to somebody who now actually has a savings account and saves up for a holiday before they take it, which I know is what we're supposed to do. It just took me a long time to get there. I grew up in a home where I had all the advice I needed to do the right thing by money. My father and my stepmom worked in kind of finance, banking, numbers industries. So it wasn't as though I wasn't exposed to the information, but even having that supportive environment didn't make it sink in quickly. I needed to cause a few problems for myself along the way in that classic planet in the 12th house self-undoing. I would have loved to have not done that, but I can see how I made it worse for myself initially by not having any restraint. So the 12th house idea of self-undoing, I'm not saying if you have a difficulty in your life, it's all your responsibility, because that's not always the case and not even often the case. But in the case of me with my finances, there were things that choices that I made to spend money or not save money that made things a little harder than they needed to be. I had to take responsibility. I had to really embrace Saturn. I had to be diligent. I had to set some limits for myself. And I really fought against that for a long time. But once I got to my mid-30s, I was kind of matured out and well-rounded enough according to all of my, Saturn cycles and other transits and progressions that I was willing to try it to see if it worked. And it did. So I'd love to hear your stories about planets in the 12th house. Do you have a planet in the 12th house? Do you find that it causes problems for you, or that it's an area of your life that you too struggle just like I did? If you want to hear more about astrological techniques and approaches of working with planets in the 12th house, definitely check out my webinar, 12th House Planets. And if you want to understand the theory and the concept and the philosophy behind the 8th and 12th houses, then check out my webinar, Diving into the Darkness. It's always a pleasure to share astrology with you. I know this is a slightly more vulnerable and revelatory video than I usually record, but I hope it's helpful. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I look forward to sharing more with you in the future. Bye for now.